Happy Black History Month. We are excited to bring to you today our February 3rd, 2022 convocation. Today, we have Professor Eliasa Shabazz, Malcolm X's and Dr. Betty Shabazz's daughter. Today, our actual title of the convocation is Leveraging the Legacy and Dispelling the Misconceptions of Malcolm X. And before I let our BCC labor student, Autumn Rhodes, provide some background information and bio of Professor Shabazz, I would like to remind everyone that we have the Q&A function. So when you are listening to Professor Shabazz speak, if you have questions, please go ahead and just put those in the Q&A, and we will get through those once she wraps up her speech. So right now, I would like to introduce Ms. Autumn Rhodes. She is our media student manager for the Black Cultural Center here at Berea College. Autumn.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gamble, for that introduction. Hello, all. Professor Eliasa Shabazz is an award-winning author, educator, and producer. She has authored 5 historical novels and has served as project advisor for the PBS award-winning film Prince Among Slaves documentary. She is co-chairperson of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center. In her work to preserve the legacy of her parents, she has dedicated herself to institution building and intergenerational leadership development with the tenets of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ms. Shabazz has furthered her community impact with the City University of New York's Office of Academic Affairs, where she created curriculum to encourage higher education for underserved inner-city high school dropouts. She has worked with the Office of the Mayor in Mount Vernon as Director of Public Affairs and Special Events. She founded and produced a young adult development program. The purpose of the program was to provide insight on social justice, encouraging personal empowerment. As president and founder of Eliasa Shabazz Enterprises, she produces a variety of forums dedicated to power, possibility, and sovereignty. Ms. Shabazz is a member of the SOAR Higher Cabinet Committee for New Paltz College, a member of the Advisory Council for the Equal Rights Amendment Coalition, a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and she serves as a trustee for the Harlem Symphony Orchestra. Ms. Shabazz holds a Master of Science in Education and Human Resource Development from Fordham University and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from New Paltz College. Currently, she is an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, where she teaches perspectives on justice in the Africana world. Grounded in the commitments of her parents, Ms. Shabazz emphasizes empowerment and inclusion in her teaching and scholarship. Without further ado, Professor Eliasa Shabazz.
Hello, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Good afternoon, Berea College. I'm honored to be with you today as a daughter of Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz, and to participate in the Carter G. Woodson Memorial Convocation. To the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education and to Berea College Black Cultural Center. Thank you for your dedication and for allowing all of us the opportunity to gather and fellowship today. We give praise to the Almighty, praise to our ancestors, particularly the refined, industrious, Indigenous men and women of African ancestry, Black, Indigenous, people of color, those who have not been properly honored in history. Their stories have not been properly recorded. We give praise to the countless men and women who birthed thriving civilizations and those who endured the physical and psychological traumas, who endured the largest forced migration of a people in the history of mankind, and yet we still stand and prosper with the richness of their blood in our veins together. We are strong, we are vigilant, and we are faithful. As a nation, we face great challenges. Today, we gather to create hope as we make our way through a double pandemic. One began in 2019 with the coronavirus, and the other in 1492 with Spanish ships invading Haiti, beginning the captivity of Black and Brown indigenous people on their homeland. It was exacerbated in 1619 when refined and indigenous Africans were captured and trafficked to the Americas under inhumane treatment. Indeed, now in 2022, as we witness the symptoms and side effects of miseducation and generational trauma, resulting in the senseless loss and incarceration of so many human lives, we must choose the legacy of community over chaos. We're haunted by the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, and Sandra Bland, haunted by the murders of Tamir Rice, Elijah Brown, Freddie Gray, and Breonna Taylor, haunted by the murder of young Emmett Till and so many countless, nameless, faceless others. Yet we will not be crippled by despair in this racial pandemic, nor will we be blindsided by divisive tactics that deprive us of liberty and justice. Malcolm X and Dr. King are often portrayed as polar opposites. People often come and whisper to me that they were on the side of Malcolm or that they were on the side of Martin. We do not have to choose because both young men challenged this unjust and immoral world. Even though they had their philosophical differences, my father's point of view was human rights and Dr. King's point of view was civil rights. Both are needed to accomplish our ultimate goals. My father simply said, "We demand our human rights as your brother," not asking. "We demand our human rights ordained by God." You see, Malcolm basically said, when we are presented with divisive tactics which force us to choose one over the other, and our objective is the greater good, we must choose to come together. And I tell my students that in my day, we were programmed to believe we had to choose either Tupac or Biggie Smalls, Martin or Malcolm, rather than embrace each for their craftsmanship, for their undying love and commitment to their people. Malcolm X and Dr. King make the ultimate sacrifice for the advancement of humanity. We should not have to choose. And so now it's your turn to stand on their shoulders and take the baton. Stand on the shoulders of so many young people. You might say it's easier said than done, but I've seen the beauty of community. I've seen sisterhood firsthand. After my father and Dr. King were respectively assassinated, my mother and Aunt Coretta Scott King became best of friends, best of buddies, sister friends. Years later, Dr. Bernice King and I became sister friends as well. The Shabazz Center itself was inspired in part by the King Center. We can either fight each other or fight for each other. And it should be noted that when we fight for each other, our possibilities are limitless. In these challenging times, we must become agents of hope, creating a society that works for everyone. This means challenging systems that maintain disproportionate incarceration rates of young Black men, systems where poverty rates for Black children are 3 times that of white children, with Black children being the minority. We must seize upon hope and propose legislation that combats these harsh realities. There are many ways we can become agents of hope. In the 1870s, 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the songs of the young angelic Fisk Jubilee singers, college students, your age, only 5 years removed from slavery. These young men and women introduced the world to the great spirituals. In 1870, the atrocities endured on and off the plantations in song, echoing the refrain that Black Lives Matter too. Through their voice, the Jubilee singers were able to buttress, to demonstrate our universal humanity. Even they understood that Black power is not exclusionary, it simply acknowledges that we are also members of the human family. Whether in the songs of the Jubilee singers, the marches of the civil rights movement, the sit-ins of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panthers, or the actions of countless young activists fighting against bigotry, we too are creating hope, inspiration, solutions, and new dreams. Yes, new dreams. My father spent much of his life fighting Jim Crow. He sought solutions to the human predicament in a country determined to divide and conquer. His main critique of America was that it had failed to live up to its promise of liberty and justice for all. In the 1950s, when young people were asking for civil rights, organizing, demonstrating, and marching for integration, for quality education, housing, basically respect of human life, my father came along also in his 20s and said, "We demand our human rights as your brother. We demand our human rights ordained by God." And so for the first time, he introduced a human rights agenda to the civil rights movement. In less than 12 years of his young life, he demanded that the world was miseducated about Africa as the first world nation. He internationalized the struggle for Blacks worldwide, that wherever Black, Indigenous people of color were, that they were experiencing the same inhumane treatment. And he sought to reimagine the national and international political landscape. In April of 1957, Minister Malcolm X exposed the world to the corruption of police forces across America. While my father was the national spokesperson and minister at Harlem's Mosque, one of its members was severely beaten. This young man's name was Hinton Johnson. And so Johnson yelled out at officers as he saw them viciously beating another young man, saying, "You're not in Alabama, this is New York." Now, the officers did not take kindly to Johnson's compassion in 1960s, let alone his expression of free speech. So they turned their attention away from the young victim and onto Hinton Johnson. The police officers proceeded to beat Johnson with their clubs so violently that he received permanent brain damage from men paid by the people to protect and serve the people. And so I'm going to assume that most of you have seen Spike Lee's film, Malcolm X. And I'm going to also assume that you recall in the scene where Minister Malcolm X effectively organized members of his mosque to strategically mobilize in protest of this incident. And the lieutenant responded, "This is too much power for one man to have, let alone Black man." Well, as a rule, each member was responsible for two members. Each member was responsible for two members. And so that particular evening, each member was responsible for calling two members on the telephone. And it became a strategic domino effect, much like when you organized a skillful protest following the murder of George Floyd. When in the first time of our modern history, You inspired protesters in 50 states and 18 countries abroad, protesters, young and old of every nationality of the global human family, proclaiming Black Lives Matter. And if I were there, I'd give you a round of applause. So let's give praise and a brief moment of silence to this generation for bringing the world together to acknowledge bigotry and its inhumane, unlawful crimes committed against Black life. That Black people's human rights must be protected like everyone else, and it is inclusive in the human family. We work together based on a common goal of human compassion and demanding change. And so, heeding my father's call 55 years ago, hundreds of brothers and sisters rushed to Johnson's aid. In a matter of minutes, they organized outside the police station where he was being held. They demanded that their brother be released from jail and be given prompt and thorough medical attention. And although the protesters' demands were initially ignored, they did not relent. They refused to leave until the appropriate medical attention for this innocent man was administered. They did not quit until they accomplished their identified goal, ladies and gentlemen. Their spirit of activism has much to teach us today. The words of the late Congressman John Lewis ought to haunt us as we still face injustice. Amid the civil rights struggle, John Lewis asked two pertinent questions. If not us, who? If not now, when? And so, in a time where so many in our community struggle to find an encouraging voice and a helping hand, we must ask, if not us, who? In a Senate that wants to play politics, when we need a voting rights bill passed, as my father said in 1964, if not now, when? In a vacuum of deafening silence to the constant refrain of police brutality, and we are called to speak out to the powers that be, we must ask, if not us, who? And in a court packed with judges who sentence our children as adults, and we wait for the tide of justice to turn, we must ask, if not now, when? And so in our country, where critical race theory is quickly being outlawed, students need someone to provide the simple truths about education, about history, the truth about all and not a select few of the founders of the bustling, industrious land of milk and honey, the truth about how this great nation was cultivated by the significant contributions and sacrifices of our ancestors so that every single American today has the opportunity to call the United States of America their home. We must ask, if not us, then who? As inequality still stands in the way of progress, and we still gather to fight for justice, we must ask, if not now, then when? Dr. King's words still ring true. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But we need to add one caveat. The arc of the moral universe does not bend on its own. It requires our individual and collective effort. We must work together, pray together, walk together, and stand together. And we must overcome injustice together. It is the only way. We must continuously seek to support one another and push to find our way forward, together. Only together can we heal the wounds of oppression in our communities. Only together will we find solutions. My father said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And while these past years have brought awareness to the wounds of our collective humanity, we must do more to ensure that Black, Brown, Indigenous Americans are no longer murdered by police. We must do more to critique, dismantle, and reform the unjust, separate sets of rules under which America operates. America's truth and its history must be taught to our students in every school and at every level. This is just part of our path forward. Educational textbooks that teach every single American child that Black history is American history, and that American history is also Hispanic history, Native American history, and Asian history. There's no American history unless each and every voice is heard on the pages of those textbooks. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the beauty of our America. To have representatives of every nation cohabiting right here together. This is the beauty of our nation. I mean, let's face it, if the voluminous pogroms against the Aboriginal Americans, slavery, Jim Crow, the 1920s massacres of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida, if these were taught in high school history classes along with the 1930s European Jewish Holocaust and the 1940s internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, then we would be well informed and more citizens would understand the need for the federal government to appoint a committee to explore financial remuneration and the psychosis of those who have systematically targeted others for extinction by the bigotry of his fellow man. The other day, I read that a school district in Missouri voted to ban Toni Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye. One member who cast her vote to ban this book about the trauma of racism during the Great Depression said, by all means, buy the book for your child, but I would not want this book in our school for anyone to read. And what does it say about you and your value system when you close your eyes and shut your ears to bigotry and injustice of any kind? Each of us is accountable for our actions or lack thereof. If students were to learn in world history class that Africa is the cradle of the most advanced civilizations, hence the impressive kingdoms of Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, Congo, Egypt, in the same way we learn about ancient Greece and Rome, we might better appreciate the beauty and magnificence of civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as both the foundation and an extension of our humanity. But how do we as individuals react to this moment? What can we do to help bring about a more egalitarian society and fully educate all Americans as a start? We as a people must be self-reflective, acknowledge truth, and hold ourselves accountable for the narrative that history records for the next generation. When we tell and preserve our story, we reclaim our time, our honor, and our narrative. And it's likely why Janet Jackson produced her own documentary to share the historic journey of the most famous family entertainers of our time, to tell her story for future generations accurately. It's also why I've written 5 books. You see, what my father, Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and countless other African American activists seeking relief from this knife wedged in our backs knew is this. Even if you were not the officers who knelt on George Floyd's neck, his back, his lungs, even if you were not a violent insurrectionist charging the Capitol, you may very well have been one of the 3 officers who stood by as Mr. Floyd called out to his deceased mother, grasping for his last breath, and turned a blind eye, or one of the officers who stood by and did nothing at the Capitol. We all at one time or another have watched, and whether through fear or believing it not our responsibility, we've allowed injustice in the world around us. But I believe education, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is the key to being woke to those very injustices. My mother, Dr. Betty Shabazz, taught me this path. She believed education is the most powerful tool to combat systemic racism, and I follow in her footsteps as an educator. In addition to your alma mater, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who discovered Black History Week, another educator we must celebrate is Berea, your very own Bell Hooks. She was a passionate advocate for promoting self-love, improving our self-esteem and image, and Rock My Soul, Black people and self-esteem, she said, tough talking young Black folks like to evoke Malcolm X, but they're not really studying and listening and learning from the brother. Because if they were, they would embrace education for critical consciousness. They would listen to the messages he offers about the necessity of self-love and change how we see one another. As a child, I remember that every Wednesday, Sheikh Ahmed Tawfiq would come to our home and teach us about the significant contributions that women, the continent of Africa, the diaspora, indigenous first world nations, and Islam made to the world. We learned about the oneness of God and hence the oneness of humanity. We learned to truly love ourselves, and we did. We did not rely on others to determine our self-worth. Today, it allows me to see you as a reflection of me and me as a reflection of you, to love you as much as I love myself. If I learn to love me, I can love you. If I don't love me, I can't love you, and I will be of no help to you. You see, when we don't learn this lesson, we get caught in a cycle of divisiveness and self-destruction. We can be programmed by others. And this is likely why self-love and activism were paramount in the Shabazz household. Both of my parents' lessons about education and activism are more relevant than ever. We must continue to exert as much pressure as possible to change a system whose ingrained divisive phobias are killing us. My prayer and hope are that this moment, these most challenging and pressing years, will produce present and future generations of problem solvers who focus on a holistic approach to human rights. This must be a transformative, collective movement waged on multiple fronts, short and long term, where each of us is invested and each is an agent of change. As a nation, we witnessed political unrest, a deep, constant grief, and yet it has been a moment ripe for regenerative growth and possibility. It has propelled national discourse around the movement for Black lives, the need for systemic change in a more egalitarian America. Central to this discourse is the strength of community-led institutions that reflect our collective visions for what freedom really looks like and what accountability, democracy, and self-determination really are. Now more than ever is the time to commit to the work of radical institution building. Many progressive organizations, including the Movement for Black Lives, Dream Defenders, the King Center, the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Center have heeded the call for structural, systemic change, innovative institution building, and spirit-driven activism, but we need more. This is our moment right now, each and every one of us, to bring about foundational change. We can achieve real change, justice, and love when we truly understand that we must act together. It is our responsibility as campus and community leaders to build and organize community networks, to receive the support that we need from one another, to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves, and to make our voices heard by any means necessary. We cannot continue to be bamboozled by individualism. We must abandon the false notion that we can pull ourselves up by our own individual bootstraps. Look around you, it does not work and it never has. We must let go of our differences and unite around a common goal. It is your turn to take the baton handed to you. My father said that it would be this young generation who would recognize that those in power have misused it and demand change, willing to do the necessary work, no longer fearful. We must be unified in our shared humanity. Our goals must be shared. Our plans must be strategic, and we must be disciplined. We must constantly push ourselves toward being more loving to one another and every member of our community. And as the activist Fannie Lou Hamer said, we are in this bag together, educated and uneducated, rich and poor, women and men. We are in this bag together. When we understand that our collective action matters more than our individual action, we can dream new dreams. Together, we will create a world that makes our communities resonate with the words of the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, we go together. Once we learn that we can only win together, we will stop focusing on what divides us. We must work together. We must stand together in the midst of tragedies and triumphs. Let us play the great jazz of life in the tone of love and in the blue note of justice, ever resisting the cacophonies of evil and hate. When we bear witness, choosing community over chaos, we will be empowered by the truth that each of us is a beautiful creation destined to shine our light for the greater good. Thank you. I love you, and God bless you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shabazz. That was powerful. I'll give you a moment to get a drink of water if you like, while I feed out some of the questions that we have coming in, and we already have one. So I want all of our audience today, I know a lot was said. I want you to ponder on that. For those of you who have questions right now, go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and I will go ahead and start reading those, and we have some time. So if you're thinking and trying to get your question right, that's okay, that's okay. All right, our first question.
And we are in, Berea College is in Kentucky, is that right?
That's right, Kentucky.
I was really looking forward to being there, I have to say. And I love your backdrop. But I was looking forward to being in Kentucky, but this is the next best thing.
We were looking forward to hosting you, and hey, you never know. We might be able to make it happen in the future, but we appreciate you. For those of you who didn't get to join us for our kind of VIP book session with our students, Professor Shabazz graciously met with our students, and we had a great discussion about one of her books that's right there behind her memoir.
Yes, that's right.
Yep. And so that was a very, very great conversation. So you can find all of her books on Amazon. I believe. Barnes and Noble. Okay. Okay.
It's everywhere.
Barnes and Noble. Everywhere. All right. We got the questions. So let me start asking those. Our first one. Thank you, Professor Shabazz, for the legacy you carry for your community, for our community. I am grateful that you have shared your father's legacy with us. We are continuously inspired and propelled by the work and sacrifices of people like your father, Malcolm X, Dr. King, Harriet Tubman, all of those individuals who have impacted the world. Question is, as young people aspiring to make an inevitable impact in our families, campus community, and the world, what lesson would your father want us to learn and emulate from his life and that of other activists?
Well, let's see. I think there are two, right? And I'll start with young people marching, demonstrating, protesting in the 1950s. Young people for quality life, for, you know, and I said this in you know, a little earlier, for respect as, you know, a human being. My father came along and said, we are not asking you for civil rights. We are demanding our human rights as your brother, right? We are demanding our human rights ordained by God. So understanding the necessity to have a set of values, right? And we should know what our value system is. And I think when we know what our value system is, a part of that is our relationship with God, right? That it doesn't matter what other people think of us. What matters is, what does God think of you, right? What is your value system? And you know, so my father was fearless because he served God. And I think that is what is extremely important. And one of the things that my parents both focused on in our household was self-love. And it is that whole notion, you know, if I don't love me, I will never love you. If I don't love me, I won't even, you know, understand what activism really is, you know, that we will continue in this repetitive cycle of looking for justice 55, 60 years later, right? We're still, you know, demanding the same changes. And the good thing is that it looks like we can make change if we don't allow ourselves to be sidetracked by the divisive strategies and tactics, you know, and you know, I mean, there's so many there are so many, what is the word I'm looking for? You know, gosh, what is the word I'm looking for? Now we can play charades. What is that word when people are distracted? There's so many distractions, you know, because let's look at the civil rights movement, the 1960s. You know, you had people no longer straightening their hair for the first time since our enslavement, wearing our natural hair. How do we go from that to the exploitation with, you know, Black film, drug addiction? How do we go from that? So there are these divisive and distractions that are put out there for us to emulate, and we have to be smarter than that. And that's when my father talked about being critical thinkers. And I think that's what Carter G. Woodson said when he said that the biggest race is to find out who will control the minds of young people, recognizing the power that young people possess.
Thank you. Thank you. And for those of us who haven't read Carter G. Woodson's book, I know it was life-changing for me. So if you haven't had an opportunity to read The Miseducation of the Negro, please read it. Please find time. This is Black History Month, so let's put more action to what we're just saying, right? It's not just a social media thing. This is something that is important as we continue that fight, as Professor Shabazz has stated. All right, we have a lot of questions coming through. This next question is, have you ever felt any resentment or sadness that you are the one having to give this talk, or that the talk is just that it's needed in general?
Yeah, it's needed. And, you know, when I say my mother raised her 6 daughters, my mother was just in her 20s. Now, let me just say that part so I can remember to come back to not being sad. My mother was just in her 20s when she witnessed the political assassination of her young husband. These were all young people, just in her 20s. They had 4 little girls, and she was pregnant with twins. A week prior, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, a firebomb was thrown into their home. The firebomb was thrown into the nursery where their babies slept. And so this has got to be traumatic. And my father said, you know, it's coward of you to, you know, you want me, come after me, but don't come after my family, let alone my little children. And so he stayed in a hotel in the Hilton, New York Hilton, to keep the, you know, the danger away from his family. And so he asked his wife to come to the Audubon, where he was going to be giving this speech and to bring the babies. And so my mother must have walked into that Audubon ballroom, which is today the Shabazz Center. And she walked out shattered beyond disrepair because she witnessed this horrific death of her husband. Now, my mother made sure, in spite of all this trauma, that she never gave in to being a victim. She never accepted no or I can't as an answer for herself, because she knew her history. It anchored her. It gave her foundation. And she made sure that her girls did too. You know, I learned, you know, about Africa as a first world nation, not as a third world nation, not as Tarzan, not as a jungle, not as backward people, but refined, industrious, indigenous people. That these people migrated around the world, to Asia, to Europe, all around the world, as indigenous people. Geological seismic shifts, our complexions change, our hair change, all kinds of things change, right? And so we were raised loving ourselves. And so when I was in high school, I would mentor young people at a group home, and I would teach math. But I noticed that these people were sad. And I didn't, you know, I couldn't really put, you know, the dots together that young, but I went to college and I, you know, mentored young people in lockup facilities. And, you know, and I saw the same thing. And by the time I graduated, I went into education and was shocked and surprised to see their curriculum. And so for me, it wasn't, you know, that I feel sad or burdened like my father. My father never felt sad or burdened. He committed himself because of that self-love, because he understood the injustice, because he wasn't bamboozled, and because he served God, right? But I think most importantly, he was so informed. Gosh, I can go into something else, but I won't do that right now. And so I was so committed to make sure that my students, first in high school, understood who they were, their history, their identity was as much intact as I could, you know, help. And you know, and so I just continued in that vein of work. So to me, it's my duty. You know, when I say I love me, because my mother made sure that I loved me, that I love who I am, I do not rely on other people to tell me that I'm great or that I'm worthy or anything. You know, I already know my value. And because I love me and I see you as a reflection of me, I love you too. And whatever I know that you're lacking, it is going to be what I will give if I have the capacity to do so. If I don't, then I find someone who can. So I would never be sad or, you know, a woe is me kind of a person.
That's right. That's right. And self-love is key. I know that's a common thread in your book, self-love, and we have to love ourselves before we can love anyone else. And we're so grateful for our ancestors like Malcolm X to still be able to bring that message home through you, through the autobiography, through your family members as well. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Why do people consider Malcolm X the violent activist?
Because can you imagine, first of all, you know, my latest book is The Awakening of Malcolm X. And in this book, we discover that Malcolm was brilliant, right? We discover that his father was the president of the Industrial League in Wisconsin, that he was the chapter president of the Marcus Garvey movement, that he was responsible for getting Marcus Garvey out of jail for alleged mail fraud by writing this letter to then President Coolidge. We discover that he purchased land that was reserved for whites only in the 1920s. This tall Black reverend who was self-sufficient. His wife was the recording secretary for this organization that commanded millions of followers in the 1920s. And so when you have young, activist, conscious, forward-thinking parents, you're going to make sure that your children are also equipped. And so they made sure. So when Malcolm's teacher, after his father was lynched and his mother was institutionalized against her will, and the local municipality took their land, right? Because they didn't like the fact that this man had the audacity to purchase this Black man, big, tall, you know, a man, you know, my father was almost 6'5", and his father was very tall and broad shoulders. They didn't like the fact, and had the steering car, you know, we learned all these things. So they instilled all these values in Malcolm. And we discovered when Malcolm found his way to jail because his father was killed, his mother was institutionalized, and the family was torn apart. And his teacher basically said, your life does not matter, right? That in jail, he confronts his identity and everything from which he was running, right? And Malcolm was the star debater in prison, you know, and he was 19, 20 years old. He wasn't a, you know, grown man. He was, you know, while he was in jail, but that he was the star debater, and they debated MIT, Harvard, Boston University, and Malcolm was the star debater. He was brilliant. And when he read the dictionary, he didn't read the dictionary because he didn't know how to read. He read the dictionary to be his best by any means necessary. Because no matter what he did, he was always the best at it. He put forth all of his effort.
Thank you. By any means necessary. And for those of you who haven't read the book, read it, because you even talk about what that really means. There's been misconceptions about what that really means by any means.
That's right. That's right. Because, so can you imagine? We have to create this false image of Malcolm, because could you imagine if all young men, instead of, you know, going into the 1970s and the 80s drug, you know, pandemic, the whole war against drugs, before Nixon announcing the war against drugs before the drugs that they imported were even dropped off, you know, in the country, that you have to create an image that's negative so that young people will not emulate this man. And a false image of Dr. King that's passive, so our young men will be passive. Instead of, look at the movements of the 1960s and 70s. Look at those movements and how each one of them were crushed. You have political prisoners, you know, that they were crushed. But now it's a new day because we are more informed, we are more enlightened. We respect our humanity, right? And we all understand that we can only make change together. ABC tonight is airing a special that they took the responsibility to do, you know, which offers change. You know, for the first time, they're saying, this is who Malcolm was. Malcolm was truth. Malcolm was values, morals, principles, you know? And so when we think about critical race theory, you know, I don't know if someone would ask this, it's an opportunity for us to no longer, be in this repetitive cycle of divisiveness, of hatred, of racism. But now we have the opportunity, the smart, forward, critical thinking adults, we have an opportunity to instill a value system in our young people that's filled with honesty, truth, compassion, forgiveness, love, right? And inspiring with truth and history about all.
Thank you. So tonight, and you know what time, Professor Shabazz, on Eastern Standard Time?
Yeah, it's 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Are you on Eastern Standard Time or
yes.
Central? Yeah, 9 p.m. 9 p.m. on ABC.
9 p.m. on ABC. So let's try to check that out. All right, we have a question. Is that you on the front cover with your father for the book that's behind you, the memoir book?
It sure is.
All right, very observant. Okay, here's our next question. How do you find hope in the face of persistent despair?
I have such strong faith in God. Just think, there are people who thought slavery would never end, but it did end. There are so many people who think that, there are things that we can't accomplish, but we have accomplished them. And so it's, I've got undying hope. I love my ancestors. I communicate with my ancestors. I communicate with God. I have a solid relationship with myself. And so, I think all of that is really necessary and healthy, and not seeing yourself as a victim. It's just inevitable that each one of us is going to pass away, at some point in our lives. And so it's learning as much as we can and being accountable and responsible for our individual lives.
Right. Thank you. One of our students says, you're so powerful, and thank you for sharing your wisdom and letting us learn from you. So that was a comment, but thank you, because it's so true. Another student said, have you considered running for presidential office because your message is so powerful?
No, not at all. Not at all. But listen, you think my message is powerful, you can always, when you come to New York, you can come to the Shabazz Center. You can even just follow us in social media. And we have some really great programming. We've got some dynamic young people working at our center. One of the things that we are proponents of is intergenerational dialogue, intergenerational movements. We believe that you learn from your ancestors, you learn from your parents, your grandparents, and you learn from the younger generations. And so, these are all the kinds of things that we support at our center. And so on February 21st, we will have a program that will be streaming live, I think somewhere, I'm not really sure. But if you, again, follow me at Eliasa Shabazz or the Shabazz Center, you'll get all that great information. Because I think it's important.
We'll try to share it.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll try to share it from our social media as well with the Black Cultural Center. We have a question. What was the best advice or wisdom that you've received from your father and mother?
Well, unfortunately, my father was assassinated when I was a very, little girl. But for my mother, again, it's self-love. I remember saying to my mother, because I loved her so much, and I thought she was just everything. And I remember telling her how important she was in my life. And she would say, Eliasa, focus on yourself. And I'm like, focus on myself. Are you kidding me? You're not going to say, oh, you're important to me too. And so what I, in retrospect, it was knowing who you are, having a foundation that's solid. Right. And I'm really repeating myself. All of this self-love, so that you really don't determine your worth based on what someone else thinks of you, but just understanding and knowing it, unequivocally.
That's right. That's right. Let's see. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for your uplifting talk. I have a question. How do you feel about areas for Black students or people of color? I guess this individual is speaking of like our centers on campus and things like that. Do you think that it separates us?
No, absolutely not. You know, it's the individuals in the center, right? What is the curricula, right? Because it should be something that focuses on bringing people together, right? I think first and foremost, you know, we have to be informed, inspired, you know, all the things that are necessary to, you know, galvanize people. Look at what my father was able to do when he was the spokesperson, you know, when he was with the mosque number 7 in Harlem, when he and all of the young people went to the aid of Hinton Johnson. And his name was Hinton X, but Hinton Johnson, you know, each person understanding that they're responsible for 2 people, that's like brilliant to me. How clever is that? Whatever organization we're in, we know that we are responsible for 2 people, so that when we want to accomplish a goal, we know that we are responsible to 2 people to make sure that they understand what our long-term goal is, right? So that when we finish marching, protesting, and everything else, that we've accomplished a goal rather than go back home and accomplish nothing, except that we spent all this time marching and protesting.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have about 15 minutes left. We still have some questions. So if you have some questions that you really want to get asked live, please do so. Our next question is first with a comment. Wow, that was an incredible, powerful speech. So much of what you have said is coming with and moving me forward. You are truly one of my favorite speakers we have had so far. My question is, you have written many books, all in which are very powerful. What books do you recommend to those of us who are on that anti-racism journey? And where is a good place for us to start?
Oh my gosh. Okay, of course, now I'm going to go on a blank. And if I turned my my monitor to the other wall, it's filled with books. And, you know, again, on my Instagram, I know that I've listed several books. And actually, even in this last one, The Awakening of Malcolm X, I have a book list that I have here. Because there's so many great ones. The Destruction of a Civilization. Is that by Carter G. Woodson? No, that's by The Destruction of Black Civilization. Oh, I can see it, but I can't think of who the author is. Chancellor B. Williams, I think it is. But there are so many necessary and important books, and even a video. I think, you know, you can Google it, Shake and to Deal. Oh my goodness, he just goes through the origin of man. That one I thought was absolutely excellent. Shake and to Deal, CHEIK, Anta, ANTA, Deal, DIOP. And there are like many series that you can watch. And I remember just watching every single one of them and being blown away. He's an anthropologist. He's deceased now, but he was of Senegalese doctor, you know, descent. There's so many great books that I can't even think. I'm Not Your Negro, 12 Years a Slave, I thought was really powerful. The Autobiography of Malcolm X, of course. Just so many, yeah.
So many. And so the journey is just to start, right? Just start somewhere. Start somewhere. We can't just rely on others to tell us, right? We need to be able to self-educate as well, and be careful of the narratives that sometimes in the agendas are being pushed. So just start somewhere. But thank you so much for your question and comment. This is a great question.
The Autobiography of Malcolm X is definitely great. And if you don't actually read it, you can listen to the Audible, and what's his name? Lawrence Fishburne does an outstanding job. And they even go through each chapter at the beginning and end with time music. That's just great. So you can listen to it while you're doing, whatever you're doing at home.
That's right. That's awesome. This is a great question. When growing up, did you have any passions that you wished to pursue, but overlooked to carry on the legacy of your father?
I loved fashion and I loved interior design. And I even went into the music industry, and, my mother, of course, veered me into working, for the mayor where I lived for a long time. But, now that I have done a lot of the work that I wanted to do, and now I have an opportunity to turn this book into a television series. And so I'm really excited about that. So I get to go back into the industry that I really love. I love the arts. I love culture. If I could sing, I'd be a singer, but I can't. So.
All right. Thank you so much for your talk, is what one of our students said. And I was looking forward to this all semester. Do you feel like it's challenging to live up to your father's legacy and the comparisons that may occur?
No, because again, when I was younger, yes. When I was younger, my childhood wasn't like people expected. And when I showed up in college, I certainly was not what they expected. I was love, I was peace, I was joy. And they expected, that Malcolm X is all of these things that he really wasn't. My father was love, my father was peace, my father was joy, because, you have to be of love in order to do the work that he did. You have to be compassionate to be so passionate about injustice and, about justice. And so, what was the question?
No, just the compare. And I think you answered it. Just when you were younger, those comparisons, or what people thought that Malcolm X's daughter would be like or should be like. And really, it was because they had misconceptions of what Malcolm X really was like. So I think you answered that phenomenally. Our next question is, how can we educate the next generations when we haven't been educated ourselves? It seems like past generations have neglected to conserve such knowledge or pass it down.
Well, no, it's not that they didn't. We have to understand slavery was traumatic. It was traumatic. And, that's why 12 Years a Slave, it's important to watch that. Birth of a Nation, it's important to see that, and it was such a sickness. And I know I would show my students 12 Years a Slave because I wanted them to understand that it wasn't that the enslaved were so tormented, but the slavers, the plantation owners, they were just as, because they were the ones inflicting this horror on their fellow men and women and children. And just to see the dysfunction that existed, and understand, amidst all of that trauma, day in and day out, we were traumatized because we were questioning our mortality, not knowing were we going to live or not during this pandemic. When it first happened, we're forced to live, forced to quarantine ourselves and to stay away from everyone. And, even with our prior administration, we were challenged with lots of things that we had not understood. That when we say Black Lives Matter, we understand now it's because people were being slaughtered the way that they were, and no one was being held accountable. And so, it's understanding the trauma that existed, the generational trauma. And in spite of that, when Malcolm came along, that's why people were, enamored, because there weren't too many people who were being so vocal like Malcolm, challenging people that they feared. And they didn't know that they could even do that. Here you have people marching for civil rights. My father said, we're not asking you for our rights. We're letting you know we are human beings ordained by God. You are our brother. So it's understanding that. And if you have information, it is important that we, again, I know we almost we're out of time, that we participate in preserving that information, because now we have so much information at our fingertips. And just imagine if we did participate, we would not have felt that those who were enslaved were lazy, that were shameful, all the things that we thought 50 years ago. But we would recognize that had it not been for them, even against their will, that human trafficking, prisoners on a plantation, all of this trauma, had it not been for them, no one would have the opportunity today to call the land of milk and honey, leader of the free world, the United States of America, their home. And so it is our responsibility to make sure that we right those wrongs, that we are responsible. We can't point fingers at the generation before us, just like my generation can't point fingers to the new generation coming, but that we have to work together and accomplish the goals that we want, if we really want to accomplish these goals.
Thank you. Powerful. And I know we just got time for maybe one or two more questions. I know the answer to this question, but I want everyone here to be able to hear this, because we just had in January our MLK convocation. So an anonymous attendee asked, did your father ever meet Martin Luther King Jr.? And if so, how was their relationship?
Yes. When Dr. King was in Birmingham jail, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee invited my father to Alabama. And before my father went to speak, he went to see Dr. King to make sure he was okay. And of course, they did not want Malcolm and Martin uniting, because you can just imagine what would have happened if they did. And it was even during a time when they weren't paying a lot of attention to Dr. King. And so my father he met with Aunt Coretta, and he said, if the powers that be, and he vocalized this, and it was intentional, because he was very strategic. If the powers that be don't listen to Dr. King, I'm the alternative. And so, we all know that they did not want to, they weren't going to, they would much prefer to acknowledge Dr. King for the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, than they would Malcolm X. And this is the reason why it's taken so long to make sure that my father's work is accurate. And my mother, that my father's work is accurate, and not so that Malcolm can shine and be famous, but for the benefit of young generations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think maybe one quick question. There's so many, but please follow Professor Shabazz on Instagram. She is always posting some dynamic information. So those books, her speaking engagement, so you can maybe be able to see her speak at other institutions and events, as well as her books. Let's see.
This has been really wonderful. Thank you for having me. I wish I could see some of the students' faces, but
I know we have a lot of people on here, over 400 and actually 444, but we've had more from the very beginning. Let's see.
My dad.
All right. It says, it seems to me that so much of this depends on the creation of trust across different identity groups. If you agree with this statement, who are one or two white individuals who you think have had an effective go at creating trust across racial differences?
Gosh, there's so many. You know, I have a couple who come to mind, but I don't think I'm going to say. But there are several. There are several. But I think what's most important is that, you know, we understand who we are at our core, what our values are, and then, you know, go out and understand when you're choosing people to be in your space that they share the same value system that you have.
All right, and this comes from the last question, this comes from Professor Dr. Bay. Let's see, can you talk a little bit about, I know we've got like one or 2 minutes, can you talk a little bit about your father's relationship with the great Muhammad Ali? That's probably more than a couple minutes.
No, right? I mean, no, it's a 1 minute. You know, my father was his mentor, and my father was many people's mentors, but there are many people who were afraid to say that. And my father recognized the power that Muhammad Ali would have. And being the heavyweight champion, we forget in the 1960s, there were no say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. There was nothing, you know, we were conditioned to walk with our heads down, right? And so my father knew as the heavyweight champion of the world, that he could now have people see an image of not only a Black man, a person of color, but also a Muslim, saying that I am the greatest, I am pretty, I am all these great things. Now, this was great because children would see this. That image was not there. There are a lot of things that we have today that we take for granted. We don't realize what it was like in the 50s and the 60s. It was still, you know, pretty tough. Malcolm came along and said, look at you, you're beautiful. Your skin is like gold. You know, your hair is, you know, defies gravity. He said all these things and people were like, are you kidding me? You know, because we never heard anything great about being Black and good. So my father, you know, was his mentor. I remember turning to Muhammad Ali as an adult and asking him, did he love my dad? And he said, had he not met Malcolm, his epitaph on his funeral stone, I can't even think of it. The gravestone would read, here lies the greatest of all time, but because the greatest heavyweight champion of the world, but because he met Malcolm, it will read so much more.
Powerful. Thank you, Professor Shabazz. I think that was a great way to conclude our convocation. Malcolm X continues to have a remarkable impact on those of us today through your words, through your books, through our students today as you're studying, as you're growing, as you become the next leaders. Please remember those words. Remember the self-love, right? Remember the self-love and to walk with your head held high. As we're celebrating Black History Month, and I think that's important to bring home that message. I would like to thank you, Professor Shabazz. I would like to thank Autumn Rhodes, who gave that remarkable introduction. We appreciate you. We appreciate Tomas and our IS&S crew who made this possible for us to do it virtually instead of being able to do it in person. So we're just so appreciative that everything came together. And I would also like to thank the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion who helped with sponsoring this convocation this evening. Thank you, everyone. Remember that this will be uploaded for archival purposes. So if you wanted to go back and you weren't able to catch everything the first go round, you can be able to do so later. Thank you, Professor Shabazz, and let's all remember to go out and watch that special tonight at on ABC. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.